Let me see. And you served World War II in the Navy, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And you said you were a lieutenant, junior grade,
Yes.
correct? So let's start at the beginning. You weren't drafted, correct? You enlisted.
Pardon me?
You weren't drafted. You enlisted, correct?
Well, I was almost drafted, but I enlisted just before I was going to get drafted. In fact, it was so close. When I found out about this V7 program, I went down to the local naval office, and they said, yes, I was eligible, but I'll have to go to New York to sign up, because that's where their major office is. So I went down to New York, this was in July, and I came back with my new Navy card that I was in the Navy, and there was a letter in my mailbox saying, report to your draft board, you're about to get you're to be drafted. That's how close this was. So that afternoon, after lunch, I walked up to the corner here, just a block away, where they had their Navy office, the draft office. And I went in and I showed them the card I just received saying I was to be drafted. They said, fine, you come on, we'll do it. So then I casually pulled out that other card I had that I just signed with the Navy, and I showed them that, and they laughed. And I said, well, I guess we can't draft you. You're already in the Navy. That's how close I was to being in the Army.
Wow. You mentioned the V7 program. Can you give a brief description of what that is?
Yeah, the V7, the Navy had various programs, V7, V5, V12, and so on. The V7 was college students could join the Naval Reserve and stay on inactive duty until they graduated from college, in my case, a year and a half later. And then they would go to midshipman school, and if they passed everything, they would become naval officers. The reason they did that was if they pulled us all in at that time, there were no ships built yet for us to man. So there wasn't any point to it. So I thought it was a very good program when you think about it, because the naval academies just didn't produce enough officers for the huge number of ships that were being built, you know, and that were going to go to war. So anyway, I did that, and I joined the program, and I'm very happy that I did, because my war experiences, well, you know, millions of people died in World War II and in World War I, and that's bad enough, but a lot like this friend I told you about in the Marines, he had a gruesome experience in World War II, and I didn't. Looking back on it, it was very interesting what we did, because we all came back safe. So that made it interesting. But anyway, so it dovetailed in, you know, as we graduated, 1,000 every 2 months or whatever it was in Chicago, and then I suppose the same thing in New York at Columbia University. In Chicago, it was Northwestern. It was we were under the aegis of Northwestern University, and so then we went to midshipman school for 4 months. We were apprentice seamen for a month. We had the sailor suits on that regular sailors wear, and then we changed became midshipmen for 3 months, 90 days. So we were sardonically known by the people around as 90-day wonders. Because the regular Navy guys it took them 4 years to get a commission. It only took us 90 days. But they had to do that in the wartime. And we were all college graduates. There's no point in drafting us when we were 17 right out of high school. We were too young to be officers. But after college, and of course Annapolis is the bulk of what you learned at Annapolis is not technical Navy stuff, so I'm told, but just regular education like you would get in the college. So it all worked out. You know. And on our ship, we had over 50 officers. Only one was a naval, U.S. Annapolis Navy graduate, a professional. He was the captain. He had 4 stripes. He went to Annapolis and graduated. He was the captain. All the rest of us were civilians. So, but it worked. So that's how I got into Navy, and then when we graduated, we all got assigned, you know, ordered to go to different places, different ships. My future brother-in-law was one of my buddies, and we were roommates in naval school. He was from Riverside, California. His name was Francis E. Cook, and he became skipper of a LCI 634 out in the Pacific, which was a much more responsible job than the job I had, being the junior of all officers of 50 on a big ship. You know, I didn't have much responsibility, but he did. And I've got 6 battle stars from our ship, you know, 6 battle stars. He had 9 on his little ship. They did the smaller invasions, but they were just as dangerous as the big ones to the people who were involved, you know. And I wanted to get his name in there. I want him to be there for posterity too, because I admire the LCI 634. I admire the way what he did, and he had some narrow escapes with his LCI. They were invading after we invaded Lady Gulf. They sent a bunch of ships up to an island just south of Luzon called Mindoro, because there was an airstrip there. They wanted that island so they would have air cover when our troops came down several months later out of Lingayen Gulf and then down battling for possession of Manila. And there weren't enough destroyers and destroyer escorts to escort these ships up to tankers and all sorts of stuff up to Mindoro. So they had these LCIs doing it. All they had was machine guns. And they got attacked by torpedo planes. They dropped the torpedo, and he was on the con at the time. He was up there, you know, steering the ship. The torpedo went right under his ship because his ship had such shallow draft, only 7 or 8 feet or whatever. And the torpedo was set for, say, 15 or 20 feet. It went right under and right past him. Then another torpedo plane came along and dropped a torpedo headed for the ship right ahead of him, a Liberty ship type ship. And my brother-in-law, Francis Cook, said, I was on the con and I saw a guy come out at the stern of the ship all dressed in white as though he were the ship's cook. And he came out, and this torpedo plane came in and dropped a torpedo and it hit the ship. And the ship went up in 1,000,000 pieces. It was an ammunition ship. And it just, I said, what did you do? He said, we had to make a hard turn to get, because if we kept going, all that ship's litter would have come right down on us. So we had to get out of the way. So, you know, he had a lot of close things too. Mm-hmm. But anyway, where were we?
Tell me about when you first got to your ship and.
Oh, when I first got to the ship?
Yes.
Well, I got out to Pearl Harbor and the ship was at Saipan, so I had to wait there 3 or 4 weeks for the ship to come back to me to join the ship. So I just hung around Oahu, you know, Honolulu, and I used to go out to Waikiki Beach all the time and swim because I was on the swimming team in college, so I fancied myself a pretty good swimmer. And one day I decided to take a surfboard out. I'd never been on a surfboard. So and it was famous for that, you know. So I went out there with a surfboard. I got on a surfboard on a wave going in, but I was inexperienced. I didn't know what I was doing. And I fell off the surfboard forward. And the surfboard, with nobody on it now, went whizzing right by my head. This far from my head. If that surfboard had hit my head, I would have been killed right on the spot, or at least unconscious and drowned. That's the closest I ever came to being injured or killed in the Navy. This close from a surfboard, which is, when you think about it, it's crazy. And then another day, have you ever heard of Duke Kahanamoku? Well, I'm not surprised. He was a famous swimmer. In 1912, in the Stockholm Summer Olympics, he was the fastest swimmer in the world, you know, sprint, freestyle. He was from Honolulu. He was Polynesian aristocracy. That's why they called him Duke. You know, the Polynesians had inhabited the Hawaiian Islands hundreds of years before white men came there. And I saw this big canoe go out with people in it. And I asked somebody, what's that? They said, oh, that's Duke Hanamuko. He takes people out in that outrigger canoe, you know. I went, oh, no kidding. So I walked down the beach a little ways, and I came upon a Duke, and I introduced myself to him. I was in uniform, so he was ready to be, I guess, friendly, you know. And I said, I told him who I was, and I said, you know, you're a big hero of mine. And he didn't know what I was talking about. He said, my father was a Swede. He grew up in Stockholm. He lived in Stockholm till he was in his 20s. And he went to the 1912 Olympics, and he saw you swim and win the titles in the 1912. So 10 years later, when I was born, and we had a summer cottage, and I learned to swim as a little kid, my father, he told me how he'd seen Duke Hanamuko win in Stockholm, Sweden in 1912, and the Duke got a big kick out of it. So anyway, finally our ship came in and I went aboard. And some of those older guys, chief petty officers, you know, who had been in the Navy before the war and so on, guys in their 30s and 40s, they took one look at me coming aboard, and I can just imagine what they were thinking. Who the hell is this kid coming aboard? He looks like a high school kid. But anyway, we immediately, or almost immediately, we went all the way down to Guadalcanal. Have you heard about Guadalcanal? Well, we were there, you know, a couple of years after the fighting ended. And there's an island called Tulagi just across the strait from, it's like going from New Haven over to the North Shore of Long Island, you know, 20 or 30 miles. There was a harbor there, and we were in there. And we picked up troops to take up to the first battle that I was involved in, the Palau Islands, which there were two islands that were invaded, Peleliu and Angar, and we did the Angar, and I was with the small boats at that time. I was going in and putting the troops on the beach at Angar, but we had no surface opposition there. There was no fighting, so we never lost any troops or anything. And there was an air strip there. That's why we invaded Angar. Most of it went into the Peleliu, which was 20 miles north. And the vicious fight with Marines fighting, the Japs were fighting out of caves and all sorts of stuff. And a couple of guys I went to college with died there. They were lieutenants, you know, in the Marines. They're the ones who got it first. I had a very high death rate, junior officers in the Marines and the Army, because they had to lead, you know. But anyway, we did that, and then that was in September. And then October 20th, we took troops into October 22nd to Leyte Gulf, invading the Philippines. And October 20th, the first wave went in, mostly LSTs, LCIs, the kind of ships that can go right up on the beach. And the big ships like us, we came in 2 years later, took two days later, and dropped off tens of thousands of troops because we could carry that many. And that's when MacArthur, I think, when he waded ashore there in the Philippines with his shoes on, I think we were unloading troops. I don't know the exact day that they took that picture, but it was at that time. So anyway, we got that done, and by this time I was doing different work on the ship. I was in the 1st Division. I was in charge of, we had 5 holds full of stuff, ammunition, food, jeeps, barbed wire for the troops on shore. Once we got the troops ashore, we had to spend 2 or 3 days unloading the ship of all the other stuff that the troops needed. In the meantime, the Japanese sent 4 fighting fleets to get us from different directions, down through a strait in the south of Leyte, one in the strait north of Leyte, and two from the south, by the way, and then another one. The Japs sent a big fleet of aircraft carriers who didn't have any airplanes anymore down to succor Admiral Halsey to go chasing them. Well, anyway, that night when we were unloading, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, it was a beautiful starlit night, gorgeous night. But we were working hard. We've been working all night long unloading stuff for the troops. There was a violent thunderstorm down south, past where we could see it, 30, 40 miles away, whatever it was. But it was so strong and so violent, we could hear it clearly up where we were. Well, we later found out that wasn't a thunderstorm. That was Admiral Ohlendorf with 6 American battleships crossing the T on the Japanese coming up the strait, like this. And crossing the T means you can fire all your big guns at the enemy. The enemy coming up this way can only fire their forward guns at you. And it's a famous battle, and it's probably the last time in history that a naval battle was fought where one side was crossing the T, because now it's all aircraft carriers and planes dropping torpedoes and bombs and stuff. They don't get close contact anymore. So we heard that, and that was we didn't know what was going on. And if those guys had gotten through, our ships beat them all off. If they had gotten through, I wouldn't be here talking to you now, because that battleship would have come in from 15 miles away. He would have clobbered every ship of ours that was anchored there, unloading troops on the beach. So 2 or 3 years ago, an editor of Newsweek magazine, I forget his name now, he wrote a bestseller book entitled The Greatest Sea Battle in History. And this is the battle he was describing. So our ship was at the epicenter, our ship and other ships, at the epicenter of the greatest sea battle in all history, and we didn't know it at the time. So I thought, hey, that's pretty cool, Before that, the greatest battles were when the Persians tried to invade Athens, Greece, 500 BC. The classical Greeks, so you may know about that, you've heard about that battle. They beat off the Persians, and then when Admiral Nelson, the British admiral, defeated the French fleet at Trafalgar in, I think, 1805. Those were the greatest battles until this one. Now this one's the greatest one. I survived it. We all did. We were lucky. But anyway, that was that. So then we went to, I think it was Saipan or Guam, one or the other, and picked up a lot of troops to take them down to New Caledonia, way down in the deep south of the South Pacific, about the same latitude as Canberra, Australia, it's way south, to take them down there for rest and rehabilitation. And I was standing watches, and at night we were going by the big island there. Can't think of the name of it offhand. And there were little rocky islets at night, and they were spewing up fire. These little rocks, there were volcanics underneath. And we got within the night that before we were to land in New Caledonia and let the troops off for rest and rehabilitation. All of a sudden, our whole fleet turned around and headed back north. MacArthur was in trouble in the Philippines. The opposition that the Japs gave was much tougher than they'd anticipated. And he called these troops back to help do the fighting. We had to take these poor guys all the way back to the Philippines where they were fighting, And then, that was in October or November. In January, we were part of the invasion of Lingayen Gulf, a huge fleet. that went up through. And we had, by that time, the Japs are having kamikazes, planes. They weren't torpedoing anymore. They were just steering their planes right into our ships, and committing suicide in the process. And so we had a couple of close calls with. Our ship never got hit, but other ships that we were with got hit by kamikazes. But it was, a couple of 200, 300, 400 yards away. It wasn't the same as getting hit yourself. So we were up at Lingayen Gulf. There was a huge clutter of ships there. God, there were so many ships unloading, because it was a big operation, with an awful lot of people involved. So then, that took care of Lingayen Gulf. So then we went back to all the way back to the Guadalcanal to pick up Marines to fight at Okinawa, April 1. And we went to Okinawa, April 1, with the 6th Marine Division, the 29th Regiment of the 6th Marine Division. And they had an officers club down at Guadalcanal on the beach there, right opposite where we were anchored. And we found out that they had an officers club there, and we wanted to see if we could get our officers to go to the club, and have a few drinks and so on. And they said, well, our ice machine just broke down. If you have an ice machine that works and you can furnish with us with ice, you can come to our club. So we worked out a deal. So we were so close up to the shore because it was a steep drop off there that you could almost throw a rock over to the officers club. So I went over and I saw a Marine in there, a kid that I grew up with, only he was older than me, right here in Whitneyville. And I got to talking with him, and he told me he'd gone to Dartmouth. And I said, I went to Wesleyan. He said, we got a Wesleyan guy right here. I said, who's that? He said, it's Bill Satterthwaite. I said, he was on the swimming team with me at Wesleyan. He was a first lieutenant. So I said, where is he? He's in that tent right behind here. So I went back to the tent. And Bill and I, he'd gotten a lot of mail. He was going through his mail. And we were talking, and it's only one thing I remember him saying. And you can, when I tell you, you'll realize why I still remember it. He told me that he had a strong feeling that he was never going to survive Okinawa. And he didn't. We put the troops on the beach there on April 1, and then we came back in August, after the war had ended. And I got permission to go over to Marine headquarters on the other side of the island to look up Bill Satterthwaite. And I got there, and they shook their head. They told me he got killed. He's buried. There was a plateau up in the middle of the island there with thousands, a huge cemetery, thousands of crosses there, dead bodies. I was with another guy, and we walked up and down the rows for half an hour, and we finally found his cross with his name on it. Well, I'll never forget that. And then, since I was the junior officer on the ship, and we had so many officers and whatnot, I sometimes felt, what the heck am I doing here? I'm not doing anything important, for the war, for the ship. But we had 4 guys on the ship who were worse shape than I was. We had 4 doctors, MDs on the ship. They were with us the whole year, and they never did a damn thing. Because what were we doing with 4 doctors on the ship? Originally, the doctors were put on the ship because when we had invasions, they had planned to take wounded guys off the beach and bring them on the ship where the doctors could treat them, like we were a hospital, sort of a hospital ship. But we never became that. They had a hospital, real hospital ships. There were only hospital ships that took over, but they never took the doctors off the ship. One time a guy, one of the crew got appendicitis, And the doctors, I'm told, fought over who was going to make the operation. And the senior doctor, lieutenant commander, a stately Virginia gentleman, old style Virginia aristocracy, the language and everything. He pulled rank and he did the operation. Well, anyway, that was the second time we were at, and by this time the war had ended. And we were back at Okinawa. We were taking troops there, and then the war ended, so we dropped the troops off. And we were just there, anchored, just hanging in there, waiting for orders to do something. And a typhoon came up while we were anchored there. And I had the mid-watch. You know what the mid-watch is? You're on watch from 12 midnight to 4 in the morning. You had people on watch all the time, 4-hour watches, all around the clock. And I was on a mid-watch. And 4:30 or 4:15 or whatever, after I got through the watch, I went to bed, fell asleep, obviously real hard. And then I woke up, I don't know, 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, whatever it was. And we were at anchor, and the ship was going like this, a big ship. It woke me up. I said, what's going on here? So, luckily, I got dressed and went up to the, you know, where the wheelhouse and so on, to find out what's going on here. We were underway. We weren't at anchor anymore. We pulled up the anchor and taken off. What's going on? I said, well, we got a heavy storm coming. It turned out it was a typhoon. And I said, oh. And the guy I talked to was another junior officer. I was still an ensign, I think, but he was a JG. He said, we're heading out. He said, I don't know if I can handle it or not. I said, what do you mean? Well, he meant we had radar. We had two radar machines there. One for surf radar for ships and the other for air radar for airplanes. And he had never done that before. So he was worried about doing it right, you know. So I said, well, you want me to take over? He said, would, because I had done it before. I was experienced at it. He said, yeah, would you? I said, sure, I'd be glad to. So I took it over. So we were at sea. We were out going in a typhoon, hurricane. And a few minutes later, the captain was up on the flying bridge, out in the open, for visual, you know. And he called down to me. He didn't know that I had taken over, or who was, but he knew that somebody was on the radar watch. He said, it's raining so hard that I can't see the bow of our ship 150 feet away. And he said, the ship is in your hands. Here I was, the junior officer out of 50 officers on the ship, and all of a sudden I'm responsible for the safety of the ship. I said, yes, sir, or aye, sir, whatever. And I didn't feel scared at all because I knew what I was doing. And a few minutes later, I called up, I said, there are 4 ships coming right down at us. And if we stay, they're close together, and if we stay on our course, we're gonna hit them. And the captain said, okay, so what do I do? I said, give it starboard, or move to starboard, you know, 20 or 30 degrees to starboard. So the ships were still a couple of miles away, you know. So we went to starboard at my orders, and then the rain let up a little bit, and the ships went by, and the captain called down to me. He said, there are 4 LSTs, big landing ships, the biggest of the landing ships that can go on the beach. They can carry tanks and everything, all together. And the reason they were coming the wrong way was they had very slow engines. They could only do about 10 or 12 knots. And their engines weren't powerful enough to keep them going into the wind, into the storm. They had to turn around and run with the wind. That's all they had. And they were going to, they were only a few miles from the island of Okinawa. I'm sure they ran ashore right on Okinawa, head first, I guess. But we missed them. And then I said, a few minutes later, I said, there's another ship we're headed straight for that's going the same way we are. But if we keep on the present course, we're going to collide with them. Well, what do? I said, return to the original course, which he did. And then the weather opened up again, and we saw that ship. It was going the same direction we were. And I thought to myself, I didn't think much. This was just routine stuff to me at the time. And I didn't think much about it at all. I forgot about the whole business until I got this not too long ago. And in it, one of the things it says, in here is, invasion of Okinawa. It says, the night of April 4th, in a high wind, our ship slipped a dragging anchor and worked her way skillfully through the crowded anchorage to sea. That's what it says here. Well, there was no high wind or storm the first time we were there, like they say. But the typhoon, 2 months later, or 3 months later, that I was intimately involved in. So this caught my eye, and I said, hey, wait a minute. This wasn't on the night of April 4th. This was in August when what happened, the typhoon that I just told you about and what happened. So that got me, I hadn't thought about it in years, and I thought to myself, hey, gee, if it hadn't been for me, we probably would have hit those LSTs, and the ships all would have sunk, and we all would have drowned. And maybe I did do something good during the war. There was, important to other people, including myself. So that's what I'm thinking now. I said, hey, I did do something important. I wasn't just an empty keg, going around doing nothing worthwhile during the war. I did something important. So anyway, that was the end of the war. And I was assistant navigator by that time. And the clouds didn't, and the wind and the storm survived for 2 or 3 more days. And we were out there in the North China Sea or East China Sea, whichever it was called, I forget. We didn't know where we were, but the war was over, so we weren't. See, if this had been so, we couldn't have been out there all alone with the war still on, and the Japs, we were worried about the Japs getting us, but the war had ended, so we weren't worried about that. We were just floating around out there, and it wasn't until 3 days later when, in the morning, all of a sudden there was sunlight. The sun was out. You can shoot the sun. People don't know that. This was with the old style of, now they have all electronic navigation, But we had, or whatchamacallits, and shoot the stars and so on. And you could shoot the sun, and then you'd draw a line like that on your map. And then 2 hours later, when the sun had moved, you'd shoot it again, and then the line would be this angle, and where the lines crossed, that's where you were. And we found we were something like 100 miles away from where we thought we were, where we guessed we were in the sea, because we just didn't know because of the storm. So then we went back to Okinawa, and then they sent us, where did they send? The war had ended, and they sent us down to Hong Kong to pick up Chiang Kai-shek's Honorable First Division that had been fighting the Japanese in Burma, in the jungles and mountains of Burma for years. And we and other ships went into Hong Kong Harbor, and we took Chiang Kai-shek's troops up to North China to get them to fight the Chinese communists who were trying to take the country over from Chiang Kai-shek. So we did that twice. And the second time, I have at home, I have a beautiful pair of Chinese vases, or vases, some people call it, that I bought in Hong Kong. And I still have them. They're sitting on my desk. But anyway, Hong Kong Harbor is a lot like the harbor in San Francisco. It's a narrow channel with hills on either side, and then boom, you're out in the open ocean. And we had all these troops on board. I was up on the flying bridge, way up on top, 50 feet above the main deck. And the main deck was crowded with Chinese soldiers. It's all over. And we came out of that calm channel into the open ocean. And there were big rollers coming in from right ahead of us. So our ship started going like this. And then there was a strong north wind coming down, real strong. And all of a sudden, all those Chinese soldiers got sick. And they started vomiting. They vomited all over themselves, and the guys just to the leeward of them. And it was a whole unholy mess. I still remember that vividly. But the poor kids, mostly they were young kids, they were starved. And they started dying on a 4 or 5 day trip up to North China. These young soldiers started dying from starvation. When the captain found out about this, he opened up the stores, our ship's stores, to feed them. And we got them up to North China and sent them off. And we had to bury. I went to a couple of burials where we had a Catholic chaplain on board, and we buried these Chinese soldiers who were not Christians, I assume, with a Christian burial, and then put them overboard into the ocean with weights, you know. That's what you have to do. So we did that twice. And one of those times, the first time we took troops up, we stopped at offshore and led them ashore. And we were going to be there for a few days, so 4 or 5 of us officers got permission to take one of our small boats up the Taku River to Tientsin, which I told you was a city of 1 million people or so, 25, 30 miles up the river. And we spent several days and nights in Tientsin, just roaming around, drinking it all up. We talked with Russian, as I told you, Russian, white Russians who were not communist Russians. You know, the fighting had taken place in Russia, and the communists had taken over, and these people had fled to China to get away from the communists, and so on. And then we went from there. Then another typhoon came along. This was August, September, you know, typhoon, hurricane season here and over there. We went down to Manila, and we went right by Corregidor, the famous island where General MacArthur had his headquarters when the Japs invaded, and our troops finally had to surrender. You know, the Bataan Peninsula was right there. Anyway, we anchored there in the bay, and I got permission, along with others, to go ashore and see what Manila looked like. Well, when the Japanese got kicked out of Manila, the Japanese Navy, I'm told, was in control. And there was a beautiful old colonial section of the center of Manila, you know, beautiful, from 400 or 500 years. The Japanese Navy people destroyed all that. When we went in there, it was just an ugly, I hope they rebuilt it or tried to. Just an ugly mess. And they had bridges across a small stream there. They had blown that up, you know, they did everything the Japs could to destroy. And then the Russian communists were moving down from the northern part of Korea after the war ended to try to take over the whole peninsula peacefully if we hadn't done anything. But our ship and others were ordered to take American troops into Korea in 1945. This was 5 years before the war started, the American war in Korea. And we took them in there. And they had a very high tide there, and we went in at high tide and let off 1,500 troops, American troops, and I went off looking the town over. We've got the little seaport town there, just walked around and so on for a while. And we came back, and the ship was down 20, they had 25-foot tides there, or 35-foot tides. The tide went, because our ship had a 28-foot draft, so it had to be more than that. 35-foot tides, and our ship was sitting on the mud next to the, and the pier was way up here. That's how high the tides were. So you had to wait with the big ship and for high tides both to get in and to get out. So then we were only there once, but we put American troops on the beach there in 1945. Then they sent us to Sasebo, Japan, and put American troops after the surrender, the big naval base. And when we walked in, the harbor was like this, a big round harbor. And out on the edge of the harbor in the shallow water, there were all these Japanese superstructures sticking up, ships that our bombers apparently had sunk. And the Japanese superstructures were very different than ours. They were like pagodas or something. You could see all these pagodas sticking up around. And I still remember that vividly. And then as I told you before, we had a raffle, and 4 of us won the raffle, and the prize was to take a Japanese down to Nagasaki, 60 or 70 miles away, a Japanese train. So we went down there, and there were Japanese people on the. This was right after they surrendered. Japanese people on the train. They didn't pay any attention. They didn't pay any attention to us, and we didn't pay any attention to them. We just left it that way. We got down to Nagasaki. That's where the second A-bomb dropped. And this was in November, 3 months after, 3.5 months after the A-bomb dropped. And the whole city was rubble, nothing but rubble. And nobody there. And we spent all afternoon walking around there. There was one thing that was standing. An industrial type brick chimney, you know what I mean? Big tall ones that go up. That did not get knocked off. And the only way I can figure that is that the A-bomb was exploded precisely right over it, so that it didn't get any sharp winds going, you know, one way or the other. And I think that's why it survived. I remember that very vividly. So as I said before, I'm an opera buff, so I wanted to walk over to the Nagasaki harbor because that's where the plot of a famous opera, Madame Butterfly, is set, which I've seen at the Metropolitan Opera 2 or 3 times in my life, and heard it many times on the radio. So I told the other guy, I want to walk over and see the harbor. So we walked over, and gee, there were cottages that hadn't been killed off by the bomb, and the reason was because they were on the lee side of a ridge. The bomb exploded over here, the ridge was here, and the cottages were here. It was just a little harbor, narrow harbor, it wasn't a big round harbor. So I said to the other guys, see that little white cottage there? Yeah, what about it? That's where Cho-Cho San lived, the little girl with that nasty American naval lieutenant, faked into a marriage just to shack up with her, I guess. And at the end of the opera, when she found out it was just a fake and that he already had an American wife, he came back with his American wife in the book and in the opera. She committed suicide at the end of the opera. So I said, that's where Cho-Cho San lived. And then, on December 9th, we were still in that Sasebo harbor. I'm almost through. We got letters from home, and I got a letter from my future brother-in-law, who was with LCI 634 still in the Philippines in the letter. He told me I'm still in the Philippines. Very anxious for orders to get back to the States. But that afternoon, we got orders to proceed to San Diego. We left on the 9th, and we got to San Diego on Christmas Day, the 25th. That's how long it took. Well, our ship wasn't a fast ship. We only did 15, 16 knots, going across 5,000 miles of Pacific. And so as soon as we got there, I got permission to go ashore and call home to tell them I was home, because they hadn't heard from me except through letters for 2 years. So I called them up, and it was a Sunday morning, I think. And instead of them saying, "Oh, we're so happy to see you," oh, tears and happy tears and that, everything, the first thing they said to me was, "Have you seen Francis?" And my future brother-in-law. I said, "No, I just had a letter from him. He's out in the Philippines." "No, he landed in San Diego Harbor yesterday." So I said, "He did?" "Yeah." So I went to the harbor master to find out where. It was a long harbor. It's about 5 miles long, a long, narrow harbor. Find out where he was anchored. So I went back to the ship, and I got permission to take one of our small boats and go down and see him. So the upshot of it was I got 5 days leave. His father came down from Riverside, California, not too far away in Southern California. He drove down and picked us up, and we spent New Year's Eve. Francis, I, and his father, his mother had died, in Riverside, California. And then after 2 or 3 weeks there, we got orders to go to Mobile, Alabama, and decommission our ship. So we went down the west coast of Mexico to the Panama Canal Zone, which we had to go through. When we got to the east end of the canal zone, the city there is called Colon. The one on the west side I think is Cristobal. That's the capital. And we were anchored there for 2 or 3 weeks because there was no place for our ship to go in Mobile. They just had a small harbor there with 1 or 2, wharfs that we could tie up to. So we had to wait till the wharf cleared. So we stayed there. And I'm a birder now. I didn't know Panama was one of the great birding places in the world. If I had been a birding then, I would have wanted to go in the neighboring jungles and do some birding. But instead, we just hung out in the beer joints. Well, at night when if we weren't standing watch. And as I told you, one of my duties in those 2 weeks was doing shore patrol duty in the red light district in Colon. So I had a big pistol on my 45 caliber pistol, which if I had to shoot, I wouldn't know how to do it because I never shot one, hanging off my waist. And the ladies in the red light district called me Tex for Texas because I had this. They invited me in to share their company and so on, but I politely said, "No, I can't do it because they'll court-martial me if I do it." So they accepted that as the reason, So anyway, but I had several cases of where I had to get drunken sailors away from these women and get them out of the district because they were arguing about one thing or the other and get drunk, and they were giving the women a hard time, and if I had and there were other guys who did the shore patrolling besides me, but I was one of the ones who did it. They would have wound up in the local jails, and God knows where they would have gone from there. But anyway, we finally got to Mobile, and I told you we were there for several weeks before we decommissioned the ship. And we had a local officers club which we went to, and I met this very pretty girl there that I was dating and dancing with, and I never saw her again. But she wound up being Miss America in 1951. And she, years later, I read in the New York Times, I think it was the Times, that she had married the Belgian Baron so-and-so, Belgian ambassador to the United States. So I guess she did a lot better marrying him than she did if she'd married me. But you never know, you know. Maybe it wasn't a good marriage, finally, you know. Maybe if we got married, we would have had a great marriage, or we would have had a bad one. You never know until you get married. But anyway, that was 70 years ago. If she's still alive, she's in her upper 80s now. If she's still alive. But, you know, for years I never thought about or talked about World War II at all. It's only recently I've gotten, because there are a lot of guys who are veterans where I live, you know, here. And also I go down to the Veterans Hospital in West Haven 3 or 4 times a year. I was just down there a couple of weeks ago for a dermatology exam. I get these little growths that they have to cut out or they might become cancerous, you know, and kill me. Yeah, skin cancer can be very dangerous. So I get down there, and I get down there for a regular examination every now and then, you know, for the basic doctor and so on. And a lot of the guys around here, they're wearing these military, if you go down there, everybody's wearing a military cap. So I've been going there for 15 years now, but I never bothered. But I finally decided, hey, well, I might as well get a cap too. So I got a Navy World War II cap that you saw I'm wearing from time to time. And I don't know, I can't think of anything else offhand. When I get, tonight I'll think of some things I forgot to say, but I've talked enough, good grief.
Well,
But I called my niece after I talked to you, and I asked her what was the number of his ship, his LCI that he was captain of, and she didn't know, but her brother, who also lives there in town, he had a model of his LCI with the numbers on it. Nice model. It must have cost him several $100s to get it. Somebody was doing them years ago, you know. So she called me back and told me it was LCI 634. I said, when I give my talk, I want to get his name in there. If I'm going to be immortal for, you know, many years of the Library of Congress thing, if they're going to have it into the indefinite future, I want to get my mother-in-law's name in there too, because he had a far tougher job than I did and a far more responsible job than I did, being skipper of that little ship, than I was being one of 55 officers on his ship, you know. So I said, I want to get it. Oh, she said, oh, that's very nice of you. I said, well, that's the least I could do. He died 3 years ago. So anyway, and I did want to tell you about the close movement during that typhoon, where I think that I saved the ship from catastrophe. And it made me feel, well, maybe I did do something important in World War II, after all. Because the rest of it, if I'd never been in the Navy, it wouldn't have mattered. So, but now I'm thinking a lot more about the Navy talking more about it than I used to up until very recently. And most of the guys that were veterans in World War, they never talked about it. I never talked with my folks about it. My folks and everybody else's folks were told when the war ended, don't ask your boys coming home about what they did in the war, because they don't want to talk about it. It was too bad, too horrible, you know. Well, in many cases that was the case. But my experience wasn't that horrible. We had dangers at times, and it was dangerous for the ship and me being on the ship that we could have gotten kamikazed, because other ships in the convoy got hit by kamikazes, you know, that we were traveling with, but we were lucky. If you were in the Navy and your ship never got hit, you were lucky. You were going to come back safe and sound. So I'm glad I went in the Navy, and I'm glad I came back safe and sound. And I don't know how much longer I'm going to be around, but at least I'll be on that. Hopefully for all eternity. You know, what fools. Shakespeare said, "What fools these mortals be," in Midsummer Night's Dream. What fools these mortals be. Well, I've always thought of myself as an immortal, as mortal. Obviously, we all do that, I guess. But now I think, well, maybe there'll be a little bit of immortality too because of this film. If somebody looks at it 100 years from now, they'll say, "Hey, who was that guy? That talkative guy? He couldn't talk." But I go back finally to so many, millions of people got killed in World War II and not millions more in World War I. I mean, when you think about it, how the heck can this happen, and what's the matter with the human race, the human species, that they can't avoid this kind, and then we're still fighting all over the place. There's always something going on. And I get more pessimistic now when I think about it than I used to. I was basically an optimist, I guess, years ago about the future of the planet Earth. I'm not so optimistic now as I used to be when I see all the stuff we have and the deadlier and deadlier things we have to kill people with. I'm talking about A-bombs and everything else. But hey, you got to keep going. And you can't keep thinking. If you think about that, stop thinking about it and do something else and think about something else.
Yes.
Go swimming in the morning and go birding later in the day. That's what I do a lot of the time. I swim laps 3 or 4 miles a week, and I swim with a guy who's much younger than me. And he partakes in national masters meets. They have national meets for track and field, different age. Every 5 years you're in an older age group and you compete against your own age. They want me to. He competes in these meets. He's in his 60s, and he wants me to go and compete in the meets. They're held once a year in the springtime. Last year, I think it was in Indianapolis. The year before that, in Charlottesville, North Carolina. But you got to go for 3 or 4 days, and it's going to cost you a lot of money to go and to live in fancy hotels and do the whole bit. And so I told him, I said, "Well, I don't want to embarrass myself, going swimming in a meet my age group, 90 to 95." He said, "You won't embarrass yourself." He said, "I guarantee you'll finish in the top 10 in the whole country." I said, "How can you say that?" He said, "Because there are only 10 of you left." So, if they had one here in Connecticut, for example, I'd be telling a national meeting. But I don't think any town, any city is big enough, has enough hotel room in the state of Connecticut to 2,000 people show up from all over the country for the weekend, I'm told, to swim in these meets. There's different age groups. So, I don't know. Maybe when I hit 95, get the 95 to 100 group, maybe I'll take a whack at it, if I live that long and if I swim that long. But it keeps me going. It keeps me healthy, So many of the people here can barely walk, and they're way overweight, they're out of shape, they can't drive, but I'm lucky. I can still walk, I can still drive, I can still do things. A lot of it has to do with me exercising. I'm very strong on exercising. And I urge you, as you get older, don't eat your way into trouble. And don't exercise and keep going. Because if you don't, your muscles just deteriorate. If you don't use them, you have to use them. And don't smoke. Do you smoke? Don't smoke at all. Don't get hooked. I smoked for 20 years. And when my father died from emphysema, I watched him die. He couldn't breathe. You know what emphysema is. I quit smoking when he was dying from emphysema. And I was lucky I never went back to it. I'm talking 50 years ago he died. 55 years ago. So smoking is really bad. I think. I know it is. Okay, well, is that it?
I think that's it.
You think that's it? It's 4 o'clock, for goodness sake.
It was a great
I
story.
told you I could talk a long time.
Oh, yeah. Before we shut this off, I just want to say,
Pardon me?
I said I just want to say before we end here, thank you very much for your service.
Oh,
And
well,
thanks for taking the time to talk to me today.
I'm happy to do it.
It was a fantastic story.
I never dreamed, a year or two ago that anything like this would ever happen, that anybody be interested enough to talk with me about it, let alone put it on make a movie.